All right, so we're holding on Daf Ayin Dalet Amud Aleph, and we've been sort of sidetracked, or talking about different separate incidences. I call them vignettes, but they're different cases, very loosely related, and talking about the question of whether or not, in most cases, you can establish a contract for something in the future, and how do you avoid ribbis? That's kind of the approach that the Gemara was taking. Now, we're back to the Mishnah. In other words, now we're going to be talking about what the Mishnah told us a couple of lot back, and break down each individual case to see whether or not there is a concern for ribbis and how that all works out. So we're about a dozen lines down by the two dots. That's where the Mishnah told us at that point in time that if a person went to the kaitzim are those who reap the fields, so they get the stalks, and there's from there they have to do a number of things to get them ready for actual use. So in the Tchila Kaitzrim, meaning in the beginning of the season of the Kaitzrim, so there's no shar. The shar, the prevailing price for what the harvest will bring, has not been established. You can't establish it when you still have no sense of how much is going to be on the market. If it's going to be a run on the market, then the prices will go up. But if there's an abundance, the prices will probably be less. So if he went to the kaitzrim at the very beginning, before they really did any work to know what the price should be, and he entered into contract that he was going to buy a certain, let's say, 10 bushels of the grain, and here he was going to pay. So the concern is, you're paying, let's say, $100 for 10 bushels. How do you know that, and your expectation is that you'll have a certain amount of grain? What happens if there's more? Then there's ribbis. So in other words, you're in limbo. It's not a done deal. It's not a fixed deal to know exactly what you're getting. And that's the whole problem with these content, with everything we've been talking about, is that you get into a situation where you're negotiating a deal, but you have there's no relevance to real money, to what you're doing. So that always brings a problem. So now the Mishnah talks about these various cases where you enter into a deal too early to have a shar, and maybe the problem, and there's no yeshlo. I mean, if you had yeshlo, if you had it, that would be a different story. But we don't know where we are. So that's the situation of the Mishnah. Omer Rav. So Rav talks about that, and he says, so here's a different slant on the issue. In other words, if you buy something raw, then what are you really buying? So Rav says that if you enter into a contract for something raw, then mechusa shnayim posek, you're allowed to enter into such a contract if it's mechusa shtayim, meaning that it's two steps away from completing the whole process to produce a item that can actually be used. Because remember, in a raw state, it can't be used. So Rav lays down an edict that mechusa shtayim posek, that if it's missing two steps from where it is to getting it completed, that's okay. Then you can enter into such a contract. Now, forgetting about the amount of money yet, we're talking here about, can you even enter into a contract where something is so unfinished that it's not even a cholim, it's not even in the realm of a deal. So mechusa shtayim posek, shalosh ein posek. If it requires more than 2, 3, let's say, steps to go from raw to where it is a process and can be used, then you can't enter into such a contract. That's Rob's edict. Shmuel Aimer, Shmuel has a different approach, and he says, Bide Adam, if the finishing process is strictly in the hands of man, it doesn't matter afilu meya posek. Then you could be 100 steps, obviously a guzma, but you could be many more steps away from completion, but it's in the hands of the man, meaning the person who has it. Then you can enter into a contract because he's in control. However, bidei shomayim, if it requires heavenly intervention, meaning nature, if nature has to intervene in order for the item to be considered ready, then afilo achas ein posik, according to Shmuel, if you're even one step away, you cannot enter into a deal. Why? Because if it's b'dei shamayim, you have no idea if it's going to happen. So the certainty of doing it is what is the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. Rav says 2 steps I can agree, more than 2 I can't. And Shmuel says the steps don't matter. It matters whether it's b'dei Adam or b'dei Shamayim. All right, that's the machlokes. This machlokes is tangential to the machlokes here of the Ribbis. This isn't the Ribbis issue. This is strictly, can we even enter into a contract when the Mishnah says and you want to enter into a contract and then you worry about Ribbis, is it yes Ribbis, not Ribbis? Rab says before you even get into that, we have a different problem. And that's the problem of whether or not something, it's almost like Davar Shalom Olam in a sense that how do you contract for something that doesn't exist? It's like, in today we have the futures market, you're betting on the come that there'll be either more of a produce or less produce of certain stock items. I mean, it's a whole different gamut. But the time of the Gemara, they didn't have those kinds of situations necessarily. But when it came,
but they also, excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah.
In an agricultural society,
yeah,
the rain is really part of the production of things.
and
So
that's
in the rainy season, what the Gemara could have divided it, if it's an agricultural topic, in the raining season, you have a high probability that the water will be there and the crops will flourish.
Right.
And then in the dry season, you wouldn't want to have any kind of contract because you know it's not going to rain.
Right.
So why didn't they at least break it out in terms of the probability based on the weather? You could basically decide one way or the other.
But it could vary the weather. I mean, so if there's some things where, you need the rain, a lot of things you need the rain, most things you need the rain at some point, but there could be other things where you also have to have a dry spell too in order for it to dry properly.
Okay, so but in that kind of a agricultural focused, I mean, the Gemara is agriculturally focused.
Right. So
they could have.
No, it's a very, very good point. And in a sense, Shmuel is actually saying that. Shmuel is saying if there is a process that requires b'dei shamayim, i.e., rain, wind, or whatever it is, then all bets are off. You can't enter into such a deal. You're absolutely right. But more to the point, your point of what rainy season or not is a determining factor later in the Gemara about one of the situations in the Mishnah. You're absolutely right. And we're going to get to it maybe today or next week, that the rain does have an effect on whether or not you can enter into a contract. It happens to be later on when we talk about enter into a contract.
I didn't look ahead, but
you read ahead.
I didn't look ahead.
No. But
to get this to
your point is very well taken. Yeah. But it's apropos to Shmuel, because if Shmuel says, and we're going to see whether rain is even relevant in a moment, but Shmuel is saying that rain is wind. These are all factors, and if something needs rain, then you're 100% right. You can't enter into a contract. And it just so happens some of these things don't need rain because it's after the harvest. It's before the processing. In other words, this is the processing question rather than a growth question.
But I think that's where where it splits up. So for example, if the grain needs to dry in the field, then you need no rain for a certain amount of time
Right.
for the stuff to dry properly before you can separate the wheat from the chaff and do the grinding and all this other stuff. So it becomes a question then, at what point would you be able to, let's say it's already been, if it's something like grapes, where you're gonna, as soon as they're ripe, you're going to cut them down and then do all the other processing, which is all human processing. So then as soon as they're ripe, you know you're good. But because the rest is bidei adam. But if it's something that has to be cut and then dry and then be processed by people, the question then would be whether that's a bidei shamayim that you couldn't therefore maybe go
Right.
ahead and
Right.
set the price at that point.
Some of the cases in the Mishnah, like grapes and olives and all these, are already, so to speak, in the vat. In other words, it's
Right.
no longer a situation of the field, whether or not it needs to drive everything else. But you're right, and we'll see this right now, that in this very next case, your point is right. You're right on point. So let's take a
Rabbi,
look.
can I ask just a couple of clarifying points?
Sure.
In Rav's case, he said if there are two. What if there are one? Does he say
No problem? As
no
long
problem.
as there are only two, one
two
or
or
two.
less?
Yes,
Two or less. And in Shmuel's opinion about whether it's Min HaShamayim, there are multiple steps, and Menashe raised something important, but there are which relate to it, but there are multiple steps. So in one step, it could be that it's control of man, but another step could be it's in control of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So is Shmuel's position that every step has to be in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hands, or if any step is in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hands, then it's Isser.
Any.
Usser.
Any.
Okay.
Any. Yeah. If even one step is out of your hands, it's
because it's possible that the harvest is made. Then it's possible that a wildfire comes.
Right.
And that's why I asked, because in the first case, man's in control, but then it's taken out of his possession.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to be realistic, everything is b'nai shemayim. But
exactly.
But we're not going there. We're not.
Yeah, I mean, if you're worried about wildfires, yeah, you could have everything, the flowers all ready to deliver, and it's sitting in the silo, and then there's a fire on the silo from lightning.
Right,
I mean, you
so,
can't go so far.
So we're talking about davar haragil, something that is normal, so to speak, within. And we're going to see here. We're going to see here, Michael, where in some cases we're going to see that line of what is b'nai shemayim, what is not b'nai shemayim. But anyway, that's the setting for what we're going to discuss here. Is what of all of the things that the Mishnah talks about, where you can contract for future produce, what is in, what is out? At what stage can you actually make that contract or not? So the Gemara says as follows: Tanan. So we learned in a Mishnah, Poisik imay ala godish, that if a person comes to the owner who has the produce on the godish, on the threshing floor, right? He's on the threshing floor. He's already harvested it. He's brought it inside. There's no sun, moon, wind, rain. There's no problem. Can he enter into a deal to even make a contract for future delivery? Simple question. Now, take a look. You'll see here we took it for granted. Can't take it for granted. Why? Because l'chayra, there are many more than two steps away from delivery. Mishta b'chama l'meibosh l'meidash l'midra. It's lacking putting it in the sun, right? We talked about that before. He has to put it in the sun to dry. Okay, that's step one. And then the midrash means to thresh it. He has to thresh it. He hasn't done that yet. And also midra, he has to, after he's threshing, he has to winnow it to finally separate the seed from the chaff. So he's got three steps. So why, according to Rob, do we even enter into a discussion about a contract for the future for the person who comes in for the grain? There's three steps. That's more than what Rob says is allowed. You're allowed
But there's no risk in these three steps.
So this is not a kasha on Shmuel. This is only a kasha on Rob. Because according to Shmuel,
Well,
it's all bidei Adam. It's all bidei Adam.
right. There's always risk, but it's bidei Adam risk.
But it's bidei Adam risk, exactly.
Right.
But according to Rav, the risk is in the processing, and you have more than two steps. So how do you even have a hava amina that this is a case ripe for entering into a negotiation for a contract? That's the Gemara's kasha.
And Rava never specified which steps when he says more than two or whatever. He didn't.
Right.
He didn't specify any example.
Okay, so Jay, this is going to be the discussion of the Gemara of whether or not we're on the right track on the steps, like you say.
Right.
Are we really in three steps or are we not in three steps? And that's how the Gemara is going to go through in the next few cases to when they ask that kasha. This is a repetitive kasha. There's three steps. There's four steps. So the Gemara is going to explain why there isn't three steps, Moshe.
Yeah.
And for the Gemara, we're going to show the Bechama v'Yavesh. So the simple answer is it's already been dried. Okay, you're saying that it has to be dried, and that's one step, and then we go to the threshing and the other process. No, he dried it already. It's like you asked before, someone asked before, what happens if the rain comes? Sure, if the rain comes then and it's out there, then it's a problem. Says the Gemara, our situation is already assuming that it's dried. You have to make, otherwise you're right. It's a good kasha, it's three steps. So we're going to say no, there's only two steps because it dried. Okay, so that answers Rav. But wait a minute. But what about Shmuel? According to Shmuel, that even one step, any step, bidei shemayim, is enough to throw it off and say you can't make a deal. So we were talking before about rain. He's saying the process of winnowing needs wind, and wind is bidei shemayim. So yes, you can have threshing and all this other stuff, but if you have to winnow it, you have to throw it up. The wind has to blow the chaff away. Okay, remember, we're talking about, like you said, Jay, an agrarian society back in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara. They didn't have the sophisticated equipment that we have and we use for every single step of the process. So if you have to rely on Shemayim, the wind, to come ahead and separate the thing, then according to Shmuel, there should not even be a ripe case for discussion. Even if there's only two, because Shmuel doesn't matter. Even one, according to Shmuel, if it's not bidei Adam. So that's the kasha on Shmuel now. And for the Gemara, Efsher benachvosa. That so he's already being advanced, and he's saying that wait a minute, we don't have to rely on Shemayim because there's a way that a man can control the process of winnowing, right? So he says benachvosa. That's really what we call a sieve, right? In other words, if you have a sieve, you are able to separate the seed from the chaff. You don't necessarily require what was some of the old-fashioned, before they invented the sieve. That was the only way they winnowed, is that they had to use the wind as an assisted form of service, and if it didn't have a wind, then they had to wait. But so he says, "V'nat vosa," therefore it's not bidei shemayim. So that answers Shmuel. And it also answers Rav, because we're talking about after the drying process. So all you have is threshing and winnowing. So Shalom al Yisrael, both according to Rav and according to Shmuel, there is no problem. That's the first case of the Gemara. Now, the Mishnah goes, of the Mishnah. Now the Mishnah goes on and gives us the next case. What's the next case? Ba'al ha'ovid shel anovim. Okay, that you can make a deal for purchase of future, say, grapes, if it's in a vat. In other words, the grapes have been harvested. Again, there's no There's no, it's all in control of man from Shmuel's standpoint. Now the question is, what's the process? How much process has to go into this as to whether or not there's a kasha? So of course the Gemara is going to ask a kasha. Wait a minute. It's lacking 4 different steps along the way. What is the first? The first is michmor, that it has to, I guess, ferment, ripen. It has to ferment in the vat because it's just been put into the vat. So first of all, you have to ferment it. Okay, step one, we'll call that step 1. And then you have to bring it to the press.
The wine.
The wine press. And you have to bring it to where it can be pressed into a liquid, into wine. Okay, then the next one is the meidosh. You have to thresh it, whatever the threshing process is for grapes, and then once you press it, you have to take it from the press, from the juice, and you have to put it into, I don't know, barrels or whatever they have. You have the barrels for the grapes, and then you have whatever the barrels or whatever they use for the actual liquid for the wine. So you see that there's now 4 steps. So how does Rab say you can enter into a deal? For Anavim, we have 4 different steps along the way. That's 2 more than Rab says is allowed.
But the last step of taking it out is not a big deal.
Yeah, but he's considering
it can flow out. If the vat if they're walking on the grapes,
they're walking on the grapes.
So that whole thing is above the ground. And
right.
So you just open the spigot and it comes out. You don't need a 4th process.
Maybe it wasn't. I mean, maybe you're right. Maybe it was. He considers it a malacha, whether it was just simply a question of a faucet, or whether it actually required you to go there and take the whole thing and pour it, meaning you had to do physical labor. There's some step that requires some assistance, and he considers that a negative.
Legitimate step, yeah.
Right. So he's got 4 steps according to him. So how does Rav allow you to enter into a deal to buy the wine, but even if it's in the vat, it's already in the barrel. Okay. And for the Gemara, Kedetana Rab Hyatt, he holds like Rab Hyatt, because Rab Hyatt said, "Ala komer shel zeisim." So he's going to draw an analogy, because Rab Hyatt is talking about olives, but l'chayra olives and grapes may have the same sort of processing. So what does Rab Hyatt say? That on the vats, when you ripen the olives, so Mistama, again, we don't have the specifics right now. Mistama by Zaysim, that where you're allowed to enter into such a deal, where Pia says that it's okay. So whatever Rabbi said in that case, we're going to say the same thing about Anavim, and therefore we don't know yet what it is. But Bistama, Rabbi knew what Rav was saying, and he says that on Zaysim there's only 2. So Mistama, there's also 2 on Anavim. We're going to see in a minute what that all is about, but he's drawing the analogy to Zaysim. Strike the Gemara. Wait a minute. You want to compare it? Rapia says it's Zaysim. Even Zaysim isn't 100% kosher. Why? Okay, so now we're going to get into the details. By Anavim, he's saying there's 4. That's way too many. Oh, but Rapia is okay. But wait a minute. Okay, so whatever Rapia said took it down to 3, but it's still more than 2. So in other words, in Rapia's case, what happened was that the problem with the grapes, step 1 was that it's
more than 2
harvested and has to ferment. It has to ferment.
Yeah.
So apparently in Avchia's case, the olives were beyond that step. So he wanted to compare grapes to olives because olives already had I don't know if it's fermenting or whatever the term you use when you put it in the vat for the olives to sort of ripen themselves in the vat, whatever that term is. I'm not sure what it is. But fermenting for wine, he says, is already beyond, so that you don't count that. But you still have three. You still, we're right.
Yeah.
We counted four. So you take one away, there's still three. So there's still three. So what do you say? So now the Gemara wants to answer Ba'asa dehuzavan hu denogid. This is a very interesting answer, that the process that the owner has to do is reduced by one because the last step is done by the buyer.
Yeah.
So in other words, when it comes to taking it from the
press, the wine
from the press, right? That part is done by the buyer. So if the buyer does it, then it's no longer three steps, it's only two steps because it already ripened. So you take one step away, you take the last step away because the buyer's doing it. They're left with two steps. Again, the Gemara is being very specific here to show us how the system worked in the days of the Gemara.
They're trying to allow the contracts to take place.
To even allow the contract to go forward. Correct.
That's good for business, yeah.
This is for business. And we know that we want to be as business friendly. The Gemara always told us in months and in the past, everything is done to make it business friendly. How is it business friendly if you're telling me there's so many steps and you can't enter into a contract with all these steps? So we're trying to find ways to reduce the steps. And a chanami, if it hadn't ripened, you'd be right. There would be three steps. But the Gemara says, you know why it works? Because there was only two steps. The first step was eliminated and the last step was eliminated. So so we see from all these different situations that the Gemara is giving us some specifics on how to go about doing this to enter into a deal. Now, so the Gemara says further, Va'al hamatan shel zaysim. Okay, what about, this is from the Mishnah now, Va'al hamatan shel zaysim, where you put it into a barrel or a vat, whatever it was, however they treated the olives to become fine oil, right? So it's also processing just like by grapes. So alamat shel zaysim, fact the Gemara, it's a problem. Just like by wine, there were four steps that had to be done. By oil, there's also four steps that had to be done. The equivalent four steps by oil as you had by wine. So you start with the same kasha. You have four, you need two. So now we're going to go back. What was the answer? Tana Rabbi Hyatt ala karma shel zaysim. So we're going back to Rabbi Hyatt. What did Rabbi Hyatt says? No, you don't worry about it because they were already ripe. Because remember, ripening was the first step. So just like by grapes, we said they were ripe. We're going to say by olives, they're also ripe. Okay, but for ikatlasa, same question. You take the ripening away, but you still have three. You still have three steps, the same three steps. Same answer that we're talking about where the buyer did the last step. So if the buyer does the last step, then the owner with whom you're negotiating a deal only has two, because you don't have the first step ripening, you don't have the last step of taking it from the press, so you only have two. Okay.
But one second, the contract is happening before all these steps take place. So why would you include the buyer's last step?
Because the Gemara is telling us that isn't an obstacle to making a deal, because the buyer would always be the one taking it. So you can't count the last step as a block from making a deal, because it's already ripe. We know the buyer is going to do his
It's
thing.
included ahead of time.
Right. So we know that everybody agrees the buyer is going to do his thing. So you only have two intermediate steps that you have to worry about. And according to Rav, now mind you, Shmuel doesn't enter into the picture here because this is all b'dei Adam. We're not talking about any natural cause that could intervene. We'll see still with the problem with Shmuel, but this isn't the problem with Shmuel. Okay, so fine. So now we've gone through a couple of cases in the Mishnah. Remember, there were several more. What was the next one? Remember, we talked about the clay that when they put the clay into I guess into round balls, which they were able to sell, you also have to be able to. Now, this isn't a growth issue. This isn't like wine and grapes and everything, and oil, but still, you have to have it raw. It has to be ripe and ready to make a deal. Right? The Gemara, Amai, why are you allowed to contract for the clay, the balls that the potter would make? Well, Mechusa, it's missing a lot of things. What's it missing? So the fufe, the yevushe ayla tuna, the misraf, the mepat. So again, we're going to learn something here about the processing of clay. So number one, the fufe. You have to take the raw material and you have to put it into a ball, right? Because they use clay balls. So the ball is the step one. Okay. Now the yevushe, it has to dry the yavush. Right now, again, this isn't drying b'dei shemayim. This is drying simply in the potter's laboratory, wherever he is. It has to dry. So that's number two. Tuna, you have to put it into the fire. You have to put it into the oven. That's another malacha. In other words, these are malachas. These are steps. So that's number three. The misraf. Once you put it, now you have to light the fire and you have to burn it. They're considering that two separate items. You put it into the oven and now you light the fire. So lighting the fire is another step. Okay, that's now four. And we're not finished. Lamepek. And then after he fires it, meaning after it's already gotten its what it needs from the flame, they got to take it out of the oven. That's another step. So every step, every malacha, so to speak, we've got five here, not four. We've got five different things that you have to do from the raw material to the finished material is five. Rob says two, same kasha. How do you contract for a potter's clay when there are so many steps, five steps to getting it into the finished product? So why going to Rav? Again, Shmuel has no problem. This is all now, so to speak. Now, you can always ask the kasha, oh, you can burn it and the Bnei Shalom has to watch over it so it shouldn't get burnt, right? That you should have at the end of but that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about those everything is b'dei shemayim, always. But we're talking about literally b'dei shemayim because it's natural causes versus what a man can control. So we delude ourselves into thinking we control everything, but for our purposes we do control. So we'll assume that for a moment. So according to Rav, it's a kasha, and for the Gemara, the malapim v'yevushe. So he's saying no, we're going to lop off two different items. The first item, which is taking it from clay and making the ball, and then also the next step of yivush,
drying it out. Yeah,
right. So he says those two. The Gemara says no, that's not the situation. Again, the Gemara controls what we're talking about. So you're right. If it requires all those five, 100% you can't do it. But the case of the Mishnah didn't require shaping and didn't require drying. The Gemara of Oika to us, but we still have three more. We said there were five. You take away two, there's three more. So how does Rav allow it? So the Gemara answers, Ba'asra is speaking in a case to who's Zavan who demape. Again, there's always that last step, and we're putting that last step on the buyer. In every situation, we're going to say that when it's completely sort of fired, meaning burnt, whatever you need to do, then it's the buyer who goes and takes it out. So that malacha is, we could easily have said the seller, but we're saying the buyer. So once you take away the first two and the last, again, you're left with two. Again, the Gemara is only giving us the seichel of how things were done. If they were done differently, then there's a different outcome. But when the Mishnah says you can contract, and you're asking me, how can you contract? There are all these steps. the Mishnah, the understanding is that a number of these steps were no longer required for whatever reason. It dried out, it was shaped, the buyer takes it out of the oven. All these things make it roi to be able to negotiate a deal. And that's all we're talking about is the steps, and the Gemara tells us how those steps work. All right. So now we had another case in the Mishnah, al asid. Remember we were talking about the sid, the lime to make the cement or to make the lime stone. Then the Mishnah says that for when you put it into the oven, okay. Correct the Gemara. Okay, so you put it into the oven, fine. But we're still not down to two. Why? Because we have what do we have? We have mikla, afuke, and meidach. So mikla is the equivalent of the burning of the limestone. So that's step one. And then the next one is fuke. Fuke needs to take it out. Again, we see where this is going already. You have to take it out of the oven. And meidach. So meidach, apparently, when they took it out of the oven, they still had to break it down because it was a lump. It was a fairly large lump. You can't sell it that way. So they have to break it down into smaller pieces. And that required, apparently it was still hot. So they had to take water and they had to pour over it so that it would cool down and you would be able to break it down into smaller pieces, which is what they sold. So again, same situation. It's just we're learning a lot on the physical aspect of how to make clay, make lime. The Gemara is giving us an education. So l'chayra, there are three different processes. What does Shmuel do? And for the Gemara, ba'asar du zaven ahu doyik. Again, always rely on the fact that the buyer has to do something. So the last step of pouring water onto the large block to make it into smaller pieces for which he can then take it home or take it to wherever he needs to take it, that's done by the buyer. So if that was done by the buyer, then you're only left with two. And apparently when Rav said two, he understood that in the course of all of these different processes, you only had two, because obviously going in, he understood that when the Mishnah says you can contract for wine and for oil and for cement and everything else, and he made this edict of two, he knew what he was saying, because he knew that was the process at the time, that certain things were done before, some things like the buyer being involved in the process was involved for later. So he knew you'd be left with two. Otherwise, he wasn't just throwing out a number. He understood that that's the way it was done at that time.
I'm wondering if the two that are core are assumed cannot be done by the customer. They don't have the skill or something else about it.
Right.
Since there are two that are still left for the owner and the craftsman to get it ready.
Right.
Can't go below two in the process.
Right. I could easily argue that, especially in our times when we're worried about lawsuits, a tradesman would never allow someone to go to the oven to take something out of the oven. I mean, that's ripe for a problem.
A
lawsuit, right? So, but in those days, they said, no, it's already, cool down, whatever it is. You go ahead and do it. They weren't worried about
it. It was safe, yeah.
What's that?
It was safe.
It reminds me of, it's not relevant to this, but it reminds me of that even in Europe, not even in the time of the Gemara, people would bring their food to a central kitchen, like cholent and other things, and they put it in the oven. The oven would be sealed. It would mature, as it were, overnight.
Overnight,
Now
yeah.
this morning, everybody came. There was no delivery of cholent to everybody's house. You came to the kitchen and you took out your pot, right? So that's kind of the equivalent. You took your own pot out because that was the way things were done. Here too, you take your pot out, you take your clay, you take your limestone. That was the normal course. If it wasn't, then obviously Rav would have a different situation. All right, so we've been talking about Rav and we've let Shmuel off the hook. Correct the Gemara, the Shmuel, let's get Shmuel back into the act. Shmuel says that you have to have bidei Adam, not bidei Shemayim. So according to Shmuel, that so in the case, he's not talking about the previous cases. He's talking simply about this last case where you can make a deal when they took that raw the lime and they put it into the oven, then you can already make a deal. So l'chayra, once you make a deal, so what's the kasha on Shmuel? So according to Shmuel, that you have to have strictly bidei Adam. Oh, so the kasha is different. The Gemara says there that we're talking about when the person put the lime into the oven. According to Shmuel, you don't even have to do that because there's no bidei Shemayim. In other words, the very first step of the process where the Mishnah says that the process was you put it into the oven. According to Shmuel, why do you put it in the oven? Before you put it into the oven, you could already contract because there is no more bidei Shemayim. So he's going one step back and he's saying the very first step that the Mishnah started with should not be mentioned according to Shmuel. According to Rav, you have to mention it because that has to be a step going in, because otherwise you'd have even another step, putting it into the oven. So it's already in the oven. Fine. Okay, so one step less for Rav. But according to Shmuel, that's not relevant. So you understand what? So why does the Mishnah frame it in terms of putting it into the oven? That's not necessary according to Shmuel. So it's kind of like an interesting question on Shmuel, why the Mishnah uses that lashon. According to Rav, it uses the lashon because you'd have one extra step which we couldn't get rid of. But according to Shmuel, that's not a step we're worried about because there's no bidei Shemayim there. To answer the Gemara, Ema Mishiroy Lishako Bekivsha.
The last step can't be bidei Shemayim.
No, nothing is bidei Shemayim. Right, exactly. Nothing is bidei Shemayim.
So I just didn't understand what you just said.
No, what I'm saying is that the way the Mishnah couches this last story, this last example of the limestone, it says that he put it into the, what is the lashon? The lasin, Mishiyashkenu B'Kivshin. The last story of the Mishnah is after the owner had put the raw material into the oven. So that's not a malacha anymore. Otherwise, you'd have one extra malacha. But according to Shmuel, that's an unnecessary step because even if he didn't put it into the oven, it's still ripe for a deal because it's not bidei Shemayim. All he's saying is that the way the Mishnah presents this last set of facts doesn't make sense according to Shmuel because Shmuel doesn't even require you to put it into the oven, let alone bake it.
But you have to have that step in order to make a product.
Right, but
So how does Shmuel say you don't need that last?
No, Shmuel says you can sell it even before it is in the oven. In other words, you can make a deal before it's in the oven. Why say it's in the oven? Shmuel says, wait a minute, I don't need it to be in the oven. It can still be lying somewhere else, wherever, and you still can make a deal. That's what the kasha is.
Because the last step is not.
It's
The
not
last step is just the last oven step,
Right.
which doesn't
It's kind
change
of, yeah.
doesn't change any characteristics
Yeah.
except for what the heat will do to it.
Yeah. I mean, you're going to see by the answer that the kasha is pretty weak. Why? Ema Mishiroy L'Shakor B'Kivshin. Okay, say that it is rawy, it's ready to be put in the oven, even if it hasn't been put in the oven. So we're just trying to get around this little hiccup on Shmuel, why Shmuel requires, why according to Shmuel it's required. The answer is it really isn't required. He's about to put it in. He didn't put it in. Either way, it's irrelevant because there's no bidei shemayim. So
Because it's ready to go into the oven, and therefore he says the
right.
story's over.
Yeah, it's kind
According
of
to
that's why I
Shmuel.
say it's an odd kasha with an answer that sort of puts the kasha into perspective. Yeah, he was about to put it in. The Mishnah didn't mean he put it in; he was about to put it in. Therefore, it satisfies Shmuel's about to put it in isn't good for Rav, but it's good for Shmuel. So it's kind of a little bit of a hybrid as to why the kasha was even asked. But okay, let's just say we understand the point. The point is that Shmuel says you don't have to do anything as long as it's not bidei shema, as long as it's not bidei shema. Okay, once we understand that. All right. So now we've gone through. We still have a couple of items to go, but now the Gemara is going to retrace its steps for a minute, and it's going to say the following. We talked about the potter who put it into the, he made he shaped the balls, put them into the oven, etc., etc. And we said, okay, but it only winds up being two. But on the beitzim, on those balls that you can enter into a deal, because according to Rav, because there's only two items. Tanurabanan. There's more to say about it. Tanurabanan, the Rabbanan learned in a brisa. A paiskim ala beitzim shel yotzer et sheyasu. That even according to Rav, who says that there are only two, but you can only have the two if the potter had already taken the clay and made them into the balls. Because remember, if they sell them by the round ball, which someone then takes and uses for whatever he uses it. So it's understood that the balls were already made.
We're assuming that the ball itself can be sold as a product because the owner can put it into his own kiln and shape it for whatever kind of pot he wants. He may want cups for coffee or whatever. But
right.
The ball is already a product that people will
the
buy.
Step one of the ball has to be shaped, correct? Because
and it's not hot; it's cold.
Yeah, but the buyer wouldn't know how to shape the ball. So therefore, the step one is something that the potter's malacha is important because otherwise,
Right. But at that point,
you can't sell. You can't sell it, right?
It's a commodity that can be sold.
Right.
That's what he's saying.
No, typically when you go to the potter, you're buying the finished item, which has already been baked and whatever else. But according to Rav, there's only two processes. The point that he's making here, which the Gemara is going to talk about, is not relevant to when you sell it. There's a different issue, which we'll see. We'll just go through. We'll see. There's a separate issue of why you have to make it into a ball in the first place. In other words, forget about the process. Yes, you have to do that. You have to put it in the oven, do whatever you have to do, but you have to make it into a ball. Why? Says the Gemara, why do you have to make it in a ball? Because there's a machlokes. Even in this, there's a machlokes. That what? Divrei Rab Meir. Rab Meir is the one who says that you have to, before you start the two-step process, which Rob says is okay, you have to have already put it into a round ball form. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi, no. B'med devarim amurim. When do you have to put it into a ball? Okay, now we're going to further learn something about making clay balls, which, again, what are we going to learn? Ba'afar lovan. Apparently, there are now two types of, remember, the ball comes from the earth. It's earth that's made into a clay. apparently, and I didn't know this until I learned it, that there's two types of earth. Va'ofa if it is white earth, then Rabbi Yossi agrees that for white earth, you have to make a bowl. But aval ba'ofer shachar, but when you have black dirt, kagon, and he gives an example, ka'afar chananya v'chavrusa, the dirt that was in kafar chananya, which was wherever that was, that they were making, they had dark dirt, or kafar shichin, or in kafar shichin, v'chavrosea, and in that area. So in other words, those areas were rich in dark earth. Hoiskim, Gemara is going to give us a chiddush. When you have dark earth, according to Rabbi Yossi, you don't have to make the clay ball, and you can still enter into a contract according to Rav. According to Rav, who says that you can have only two processes. When does he say you have to have two processes and you have to make a clay ball? Well, for lavan by white earth, which obviously was more scarce. So, in other words, offer lavan was you found in less places. So when you have offer lavan, if you live in a place where there's offer lavan, you better make the clay ball. But offer shachar, if you live in a place where you have dark earth, poiskim, you can actually make a deal. Why? So now we're entering into a different territory. The only reason why we say that by white earth you have to make the ball is because white earth is not readily available. So if you don't have the ball, you don't have the start of the process, then you don't have the concept of yeshlo, because where you're going to get the white earth from? You're gonna have to find it, and it may be hard to find. But if you have dark earth, even if you didn't make into the clay ball, he's saying the dark earth is so plentiful,
all over the place.
It's all over the place that yeshlo can apply, because if you don't have it, someone else will have it. So you'll go down the road and you'll find the dark earth. So it's an interesting concept here that we're introducing the concept of yeshlo here in the case of the clay balls, because apparently there were two types of clay or two types of earth, and one earth was readily available, one was not. So if you have readily available earth, then the concept of yeshlo comes in, and you don't have to make the ball. But if you don't, then you have to make the ball, because otherwise you might not even have the opportunity to make the ball. All right, so that's a chiddush now the Gemara is giving us. So now a meimer, Yoav Zuzay Mikaila Afra. A meimer apparently was makbid to enter into an agreement when the potter had black earth, and he brought it
in his factory. Yeah.
In other words, Mila Afra, he already had the black earth. But we just got through saying that you don't have to worry about it because there's yeshlo. If I have it, fine. If you have it, then I can get it from you as long as it's available. Apparently, a meimer was makbid that the fellow had to have the black earth in his possession already. In other words, the concept of yeshlo, I can go to the next guy and get the earth, a meimer didn't hold of that. Because if he held of it, why would he insist that the potter he went to had to have the black? Not that he had to make the ball, but he had to have the earth.
Mm-hmm.
But the kash is, why would he have to have the earth if it's yeshlo? If it's plentiful, why do you have to have the earth? So a meimer was makbid. Like the Gemara, come on, who did a meimer hold like? Because we just got through saying that for white earth, fine. Black earth, no problem. No problem to even make the ball.
But he still has to have it.
No,
when it's black.
But
that's the question here. Just because he's in a neighborhood where there's black earth doesn't mean he has it in his.
No, but the Gemara is saying that according to Rabbi Yossi, who says that you don't have to have it. By white earth, he agrees with Rav Meir.
Wait,
By
what?
black
You have to
earth,
buy it somewhere.
but black earth, according to Rav Meir, black earth you have. Okay, according to Rav Meir, we don't know what the story is with black earth, but according to Rabbi Yossi, we know that black earth you don't have to have because it's yeshlo. Remember, the concept of yeshlo means I don't have it, but someone has it and it's accessible to me. That's what yeshlo means.
Okay, okay.
Okay, so it's accessible. So, but Amemer said, no, you have to have the black dirt. But if it's yeshlo, why do you have to have the black dirt? So Amemer was an Amora. So he came later, so they want to ask, who does he hold like? Does he hold like Reb Meir? Does he hold like Rabbi Yossi? Who is he relying on when he says you have to have the black dirt? Come on, according to who? Reb Meir, if he followed Reb Meir's svara, Reb Meir says you can't just negotiate a deal on earth. You have to have the ball. You have to have the potter. The ball has already been formed. So Reb Meir says, forget about black dirt, white dirt. To me, you have to have the ball. If you don't have the balls, you can't get to first base. But Yossi says, I agree with you by white dirt, but by black dirt, you don't even have to forget about having the ball. You don't even have to have the dirt because it's yeshlo. Maimer says with black dirt you have to have the dirt. So Maimer is in the middle between Rav Meir and Rabbi Yossi. In fact, the Gemara, come on, who does he hold like? He's not holding like Rav Meir because Rav Meir says you have to have the actual ball. Ikra Rabbi Yossi, if he follows Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi said you don't have to have it in your possession as long as it's yeshlo. And Maimer insisted on having it in his possession. How's that possible? He has to hold like some Atana. He has to hold like somebody. He can't make it up as he goes along. So that's a kasha on Maimer. Why did Maimer say that you can negotiate? You don't have to have the ball, but you have to have the earth. And for the Gemara, la'olam karab Yossi. He really holds like Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi says that yeshlo, you don't have to have the dirt because why? Somebody else has the dirt. Ba'asa the amema oshik afra. Remember that when we talked about the black earth, the Gemara gave us examples. Yeah, you found it in Kfar Hananya, you found it in Kfar Shichin. Yeah, it was available in all those places. Very good. Okay. Amema didn't live near those villages. Uba Asra, the Amema, where Amema lived, Oshik Afra, the black earth was not readily available. It wasn't like white dirt. Okay, white dirt, let's just say white. I don't know if white dirt he means sand. I don't know what white dirt is. Let's just say white dirt is sand. It's only by the ocean. Lamashal, as an example, right? So white dirt doesn't exist in all the other places. But black dirt, that's common. Dirt is dirt. Wherever you go, there's dirt. So he says, no, that where Amema lived, the black earth was for some reason not readily available. So Idamaila Afra. So again, I'm not sure how we understand that, but let's just say that there wasn't the kind of dirt that you needed available. There may have been, we call schmutzig. Dirt is dirt.
Dirty dirt.
But maybe there's a lower level of dirt that you can't.
Well, it wasn't good for the clay.
It wasn't good for the clay. Exactly. It wasn't good for the clay. It wasn't rich black earth. It was sandy earth. Whatever it was.
Sometimes you can dig a hole in your yard and you hit clay and you see it could be hard clay or it could be loose. I mean, so it's not unusual that the earth has so many different kinds of dirt.
Right. So the Gemara gives an interesting answer. So what do we do? What do we do? Idamaila Afra. So if the seller of the dirt had already brought the dirt that you needed for the balls, he brought it some chadata. Then Amema said, okay, he has the dirt. I'm okay with it because he has the dirt, even though it doesn't have the actual clay, the formed ball. The Yovle Zuze, And therefore, Amemer gave him the money because he saw the dirt. He knew that he would have a deal. Remember, Amemer was a tzaddik. I mean, he was a righteous person. He knew the halacha. I can't enter into a deal if I don't have the product. So, okay, I don't have the ball, but I have to have at least the product that will make the ball. Now, maybe for you or I, we wouldn't be as makbid, but Amemer was makbid. He said, you have to have it, right?
Raw material.
You have to have the raw material. So to him, Yeshlo wasn't that the farmer down the road had it. The Yeshlo was, you have it. As long as you have it, I'm not worried. The low, but if he hadn't brought the dirt from wherever he brought it into the cellar, into his possession, well, some chadata, then Amemer would not have been Somet Das, and therefore he would not have entered into a deal, because how can you enter into a deal when you don't have the product? It's very striking and very interesting how makbid Amemer was, and again, this isn't lahilchasa, so these questions don't come up even in an agrarian society. I mean, today we don't really have this because it's all mechanized and you have all kinds of different ways of making deals. And I don't know how many people are buying potter's clay well in advance of its being processed. But certainly from the time of the Gemara, how thinly you have to slice the cake because Amemer had this situation. If Amemer wouldn't have had this situation, we would not have known. We would not have known that if the dark earth was harder to get, somehow it's still Yeshlo. But is it really Yeshlo? The question is he going to get his hands on it because it's expensive and maybe he can't get it. Maybe the market is dried up.
You can't guarantee that they can
Can't guarantee it. And according to Amemer, in order to make the deal, you have to have it guaranteed. You have to have it guaranteed for sure. So this is very interesting. All these Gemaras telling us now the explanation of the Mishnah, and Mishnah next week we'll get to the final segment of the Mishnah. We'll talk about some of the things we want to talk about, rain and other things. But at least now we understand that from the standpoint of what was the halacha at the time, the Yeshlo doesn't really factor, but where it factors, then there has to be real Yeshlo. And according to Amemer, even where there is more plentiful black dirt than white, Yeshlo only applies when it's in his possession. Now, what would Amemer have done if he would have been in Kfar Hananya? A different question. In Kfar Hananya, there wasn't a scarcity of black dirt. There was plentiful black dirt. Amemer may have said, "Oh, Yeshlo is Yeshlo. It's right there. You don't have it, but the farmer next door has it, so it's not a problem." But Amemer wasn't in those places, and therefore he was not able to get the dirt. All right.
No, even today we contract with contractors who first have to go out to Home Depot to buy the stuff.
But they know they can get it from Home
They
Depot.
know if it's not there, they'll go someplace else.
That's the Yeshlo. The Yeshlo today.
And we trust them that they have supply sources,
right?
Without questioning, without making.
Without questioning. So how surprised would you be when you find out you need a particular item? There's been a run on that item, and that item is not available.
So you go online.
You go stand online. Yeshlo's online. So anyway, different situation. But so we see how makbid, particularly on Amemer, how makbid he was. But in any event, it's an interesting concept of how business was done. And remember, this is all in the context of trying to encourage business, not discourage business. So even in that case, Amemer was makbid that you had to have the dirt in the possession, even if you hadn't yet started working on it. All right, so Mishnah will stop here, and we'll pick up the rest of the Mishnah, the various incidents of the Mishnah until next week when we're going to hit the new Mishnah next week.